Good morning. From time to time, I mentioned I've gone back to review some of my previous sharings. I've done, let's see, 222 plus 34 is 256. 256, roughly half hour, usually 33-minute segments. And I went back to look because usually when I get very specific information, which is rarely, I'm more of a generalist. I see things in the macro, the big view, and occasionally micro, especially when spatial relationships. I have the macro view, and cosmos, but then I can go to from the infinitely large to the infinitely small when I start talking about quarks and neutrinos. And I have an interest in physics. But physics in the newest incarnation with string theory, quantum physics. And it's amazing that when I look and what the Hindu adepts were saying thousands of years ago, it's coming full circle. And now science is supporting things that people said thousands of years ago. It's interesting. It's fascinating to me. But again, when I get micro information, I just want to share. I got some very, very specific. I was given this number. I was thinking of what was just gifted to me, about approximately how many fully awake, enlightened beings are on the planet at this time. I remember the numbers growing. It's a sign of the next step in the evolution of mankind, which will include more and more people who awaken, who remember the forgotten, who become to celebrate, to recognize, to experience wholeness, to leave behind separation and division. But I was given this very specific number, 1/100th of 1% of the Earth's population. I'll say that again. 1/100th of 1% of the Earth's population is currently awakened. And where this number came from, I don't know, it was just given to me. And when I did the math, I had to do it several times, but I used 7 billion. I just rounded it off to 7 billion inhabitants of the Earth right now. There is more, but anyway. And the number 1/100th of 1%, 1/100th of 1% of 7 billion, I came up with 7,000. And while relatively a small number, obviously, in comparison to the total, it's a substantial amount of people out there awakened. And awakened people choose different. Some remain anonymous by choice. Some remain anonymous, even though I've been doing these very public YouTube videos. For whatever reason, I haven't reached. My audience is still quite small. So, even though it was a conscious choice, I made a conscious choice to share, but I didn't make a conscious choice to remain in anonymity. It's just things can change, but it is what it is. Funny how that keeps coming up, and it can have more beneficial, more constructive uses than negative uses. Language can be used any number of ways. But at this point, I was mentioning as I introduced this that I have a habit of going back from time to time and reviewing my previous posted sharings. And I started in January of 2017. 2018? I better double check. Probably 2018, just over 2 years, but I'll go look. And from time to time. So sometimes when I have very specific information, very specific, I have to go back and search for it. And I was talking about it. I found this video, this sharing, number 62 plus, which meant it was the 173rd episode. It's 173rd sharing, and it's called Baby Buddha. And I shared. I guess I re-encountered, because I did relive it, what it's like initially, just immediately post-permanent, post-abiding awakening. What is the state? I mentioned before, I expected 100,000 Buddhists to be shouting from welcome me in a cosmic chant. And the reality that I experienced was anything but that. It was more about aloneness and helplessness. But anyway, 62 plus baby Buddhas. And I was talking about Buddha years after awakening. You awaken as a helpless infant. I did anyway. That's all I've got to go by. I awoken as a helpless infant. And I haven't had occasion to hear anybody sharing. So I'm sharing my experience. Utterly abandoned, helpless infant, newborn. And what I came to understand is that each year that passed from the time of my initial permanent abiding awakening, from that transition from non-abiding, non-permanent awakening to the permanent state, that each year from that date, if you're May 1st to May 2nd, 2013 was the weekend, the extended period of time I spent in deep meditation, that my abiding awakening occurred. But I came to understand later that each year, in other words, May 1st and 2nd, 2013, the following year, May 1st and May 2nd, 2014, 1 year, one rotation was equivalent to 8 Buddha years. Where that number came from, it was, again, these numbers, when I'm specific or something, are not my creation. It was given to me, gifted. I love that word, gifted. I've been so gifted in this life. Anyway, so 2013 to I just passed 7 years, and I'm going to try to do 7 times 8 is 56, is not? 7 times 7 is 49 plus 7, 56? Yeah. But as I sit before you, I'm the equivalent. In Buddha years, I'm now 56. Thank goodness the rate of maturity is a lot faster, 8 to 1. Or otherwise I'd only be 7 as I'm looking at you. So I'm looking at you as a past middle-aged Buddha. And I had to go back and make sure, because I had mentioned 8 years, but somehow I just wanted to verify. I always go back because I I catch myself. Last week it was funny. I talked about seeing with a little, and I said with a little c. I meant with a little s. Seeing with a little s is not seen with a capital S. A lowercase and uppercase. And I said, seen without the C in seen was a lowercase. And I know it's an S, and I heard that, and I want to address it, because I do try to, no one will catch it probably, but if anyone does, I always like to address it. I don't want to spread misinformation, and I don't want to look like an idiot any more than I have to. I kind of featured myself, I kind of see myself as a fairly wise old guy who was a slow study, a slow learner. And that was the only way it could be. That was as it should be, should, could, would. The conditional tense works for me here. Usually I'm not a proponent of should have, could have, or would have. You do or you don't. And the conditional tense, the shoulda, coulda, woulda, carries with it. It can be a basis for regret. And I mentioned before, and I'll mention again, I sit before you with 0 regrets. And don't misunderstand that this is an example of hubris on my part. I have no regrets does not mean that I haven't made a myriad of mistakes. Mistakes. More than my share, I suppose. But no more, no less than were needed. So I've said again and again, talking about ordinariness and I talk about, when I went back to listen to the 62 plus baby Buddha, one of the things I talked about was the rise. With about 6 months after, it took me 6 months to become aware of the insidious spiritual ego that had taken sway, where I thought I was exceptional, I thought it was extraordinary, I thought it was separate from the others in my achievement of awakening. Yeah, and I laugh now because I have the hindsight of understanding that this was a spiritual ego a more insidious, a more not as readily identifiable, at least for me, as the egoic self that I pretty seamlessly and pretty easily discarded when the time was appropriate. It wasn't a big deal because I never had an exaggerated sense of self. In fact, the opposite was more likely to be so. But this spiritual ego. And so that's why I always come back to, it was more work. Because first I had to identify it, like everything. There's steps in the process. I had to recognize it, I had to determine it, I had to become aware of it before I was prepared to begin to attempt to do anything about it. I knew it had to go. An ego is an ego. And an ego is such a slippery trickster that it will hide in the guise of, it hid in the guise of my enlightenment. It said, we, the royal we're special. And this was the last cry, the last hurrah for the ego. But it's made me, I laugh because if one of the things they say about my culture that I live in here, Chinese culture, we're very humble people. And that seems a bit of that's a problematic, because we're simply humble. Proclaiming we're humble might be just the opposite. We're very humble people, they say so proudly. You Americans are arrogant. We Chinese are humble beings. It's funny, people are people. And most people xenophobic. Most people want to separate their group from another group, whether it's on a tribal level, the most primitive level, or on a more communal level. Several tribes become a commune, a communal level, a more elevated, a more inclusive, because there tends to be a greater variety. Less variety in the tribe. A community has mostly similarities, but it has a collection of different people. So it kind of broadens the base, if you will. But I always come back to being ordinary. Ordinary is the condition. This is because I'm awakened. So will every one of you, if you're not already, will come to pass. Your timing is your timing. Your journey is your journey. But one of the best things about Zen teaching is that the sacred is in the ordinary. This is what really Be Here Now has become kind of a pop culture Be Here Now. Really, it's lost its meaning, just like enlightenment has lost its meaning through overuse. Just like karma is deeply misunderstood. Anything that's co-opted by the masses becomes corrupt, just corrupted. And that's just the nature of things. But I want to read here the great lessons. This is the sacred is in the ordinary. And I credited this to Abraham H. Maslow, who wrote the hierarchy of existence, different stages, the pyramid, Maslow's pyramid. sometimes called Maslow's ladder. But he said the great lessons from the true mystics, and he's saying that in his view, the Zen monks, is that the sacred is in the ordinary. It is to be found in one's daily life, in one's neighbors, friends, and families, in one's backyard, and that travel may be a flight from confronting the sacred. To be looking everywhere for miracles is a sure sign of ignorance that everything is miraculous. That's beautiful, I think. And now here we are, 21 minutes in, and I want to talk about what I want, this whole purpose, the topic today's sharing is about future Buddhas. And I want to give a little background to help elaborate, to help fill in what I mean and what the future holds. What's the changes? Well, historically, Buddhists have been cloistered. Buddhists have been, for the greatest part, supposedly celibate, disconnected from the rest of the world, a distance between, protected by the walls of the temple, and more importantly, the invisible walls. The walls that are created by this distance, separation, and it's usually accomplished by the uniform, the robes, the sign of the robe. The monk has a bowl and a robe, and that's supposed to be the extent of his worldly possessions. Some have glasses, some have sandals, some prefer to be barefoot. But anyway, the monk's possessions are extremely limited. But he has the benefit of one, cloistering for protection. He's not exposed. He doesn't really have to participate in the outside world. The cloistering, the monks are easily supported by the community around them. It's quite a sight to go in the early morning in Thailand and watch the monks walk through town holding their breakfast bowl and watching people feel it as they're blessed by the monks. So they're free from the outside. And then I mentioned one of the things that really appealed to me to the Rinzai Zen, the group that I joined, is that they didn't cloister, number one. Number two is they didn't wear uniforms. There was no robes. So the concept of being a monk without a robe. A monk, they had jobs. They worked. They were full participants in the society that they were around, that they were from, that they represented, that they came from. They were full of participants. And the Roshi, for instance, my teacher, had a job, full-time job. He would go have a beer with the boys. But his holiness was never in doubt. In the dojo where we practiced, he'd wear a gi with a white belt. And those of you that know martial arts, white belt is the beginning. He could have worn a gi with a black belt, but black belt means the highest achievement. And they said we should have no mark of achievement. So even the most advanced martial art practitioner in my tradition simply wore a white belt. And this was only worn on the premises. Be taken off before they left, put on after they arrived. So that attracted me because I didn't want to cloister. I probably spent many lives cloistered already, and I was aware of the personal limitations that it seems to be that when you're part of a tradition, when you're following a guru, it seems to that last step of abiding awakening will rarely, if ever, occur. There comes a point when you have to say to bow and thank you and go on your own. My personal experience of enlightenment was definitely on my own. But I had the benefit, my teacher, my sifu, my master he took me to the cliff and said, jump. And then he disappeared. He also did something very interesting. He tuned the universe, almost like tuning, all I can think of is like turning a radio station, helping to create the frequency that's necessary for me to take the leap of faith, a specific frequency. And this was his greatest and last gift, other than his continued existence as an example of an awakened being. Awakened being that to some extent has to engage in the world like the rest of us. He's protected, he's surrounded, he's got a environment that is conducive, it's not exposed in the same way that my earlier tradition where the monk goes out on the street, robeless, and strives to become a living example of a monk without a robe, without recognition most times. But the two people, when I started noticing when I talk about future Buddhas, this time of cloistering, when you go back to the origin, the original Buddha, as far as I know, maybe there was probably, they say there's Buddhas before the Buddhas, but I'm talking about the historical Buddha that we all think of. He was married, previously married, had to leave his family and not remarried again, but he was a married man. And most of his followers, the majority, the 27, 28, 29 patriarchs that followed him in the Buddha order, the mantle of one Buddha was passed to the next, were single, cloistered, celibate. And when it came to my own search, I dabbled with everything. I tried everything, but the biggest thing is I didn't like groups. I didn't want to be a part of a group. And was looking for what resonated with me. What meshed best with my personal experiences. And the two people that, interestingly enough, Adyashanti, who I met when he first started teaching in University of Hawaii, I believe it was one of that first year of his teaching. You can look it up and see when that was. I believe it was somewhere around 84. I don't know, memories, who knows. But he subsequently got married after his abiding awakening. And that's Adyashanti. And Sadhguru, I don't know, he was if he was married before or after, but he was married, and I understand his wife passed away, and I really don't know his current marital status. I suspect he's not married, but he was a married man. And this is when I'm talking about the future Buddhists. I realized that the day of cloistering and robes and celibacy were in transition. There was a transformation. I myself got married, my second marriage. My first one was a brief one, 4 or 5 years. But my second marriage came a year after my awakening, long after anyone has ever entertained the idea that I would remarry. It happened. It happened. And I've been led to believe, I've been led to see that Buddhists of the future will be married. You know, we have a female and a masculine. See how we fall into old patterns? We have a masculine and femininity within all of us. The yin and yang, the tai chi, the black and white meeting together with the dots, opposing dots, yin and yang. We are all a combination of the energies, the feminine energies and the masculine energies. But there's certain things that women are capable of. And it has to do with nurturing. It has to do with procreation. It has to do with renewal, celebrating. There's certain elements that women, physical, melding of a male and a female. You end up with the total is greater than the sum. You bring a man and a woman together and something larger arises. So I've been led to see that the Buddhas of the future will be married. I suspect, along with this marriage, because the necessity, the having to deal with the so-called real world, the Maya world, having to deal with it is part and parcel of being married. You need to make a livelihood. You need to think of someone else outside of yourself. And these things are enriching. These things are enlightening. These things are encouraging. So I see the Buddhas, I see them merging. I see them marrying. I see them not cloistering. I see the days of the temples as remnants of the past. We can still celebrate. We can still worship. But it's a much more secular. The sacred and the secular intertwine.